Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. As part of this course on women, business, and human rights, today we are extremely fortunate to have a conversation with Sara Hossain, who is a barrister. She practices at the Supreme Court in Bangladesh. But more than that, she's a human rights expert of great renown, has worked with the UN, both in the context of North Korea and in the context of occupied territories in Palestine. And so we're very lucky to have her here with us talking about a very vital issue, which is sexual harassment, bullying, and gender based violence at work. Now, these are all different concepts. We are talking about sexual harassment, could be verbal, could be visual, could be intimidatory behavior. Gender based violence could be physical and non physical as well. And bullying could be straight power play. Where do you see that happen? I mean, is it a combination of all three? And how widespread is it?
Hi, Salil, and thanks a lot for the question. Yeah, it's a very widespread problem, sexual harassment across the spectrum in different ways and with different kinds of incidents. But it's a very widespread problem across workplaces, certainly right across my country in Bangladesh. But I think it's also fair to say across our region in South Asia and more widely even in the Asia Pacific. And I think the problem is widespread, but unfortunately the process of seeking justice is not an easy one. And even more than that, I think people, particularly women who are affected by sexual harassment the most, are not vocal in terms of speaking out and seeking justice for many reasons to do with the kind of context we live in, because of the kind of stigma that is still attached to any complaints of any kind of sexual violence or harassment, but also because of the challenges of getting any kind of proper response or redress. And of course, the very real risks of reprisals and not being able to stay secure in your own job once you make a complaint. But what you asked, I mean, how does it happen? What kind of form does it take? It's very varied, from verbal abuse, from belittling people consistently, to calling them out on their perceived sexual behavior or attributes, to physical action, threats, inducements, and more.
Oh, you mentioned the stigma part, so let's unpack that a little bit, because is that uniquely cultural about Asia and the Asian region? Do you see it happen elsewhere too? What prevents people from speaking out?
I don't think it's unique to the Asian region. I mean, I think it is something that really prevails all over the world. But I suppose, in depending on the time and the context and the place, there have been changes in the extent to which women have been able to question, or societies have been able to question or push back against that kind of social stigma. I think even in the Asian context, we've seen places and people who have challenged that, who have said, I reject the notion that because I've been victimized or I've been threatened, that somehow I should bear the shame. In the UK context, if we go to a completely different location, and also speak about a slightly different issue, which is violence against women in general and domestic violence. A group that you and I both know well, there, Southwell Black Sisters, had this very powerful slogan where they talked about, notions of honor and shame, and how women are stigmatized and seen as being dishonored by being subject to violence. And they just turned that on its head and said, the dishonor belongs to the person who's committing the violence. The dishonor belongs to a rapist or an abuser. It doesn't belong to the complainant or the person who's affected by violence. So I think that's also happened in different contexts, but it is still, I mean, that's happened I think still in not necessarily exceptional, but in the minority of cases. And I think for the majority of women, at least I'll confidently say across South Asia at least, it is still a situation where they are confronting stigma in their own workplaces, in the community at large. And that's something that you have to think about all the time when you're deciding how and where to seek justice.
Now, when we look at Bangladesh itself, which is a very unique example in one way, because within South Asia, it has better indicators for female empowerment, for female education, female literacy, and basically female participation in labor force. I mean, it's doing very well. I mean, garment sector is an obvious example there, but even in other sectors, you do find a lot more women at work. And yet the problem persists. So is it a question of lack of laws? Is it a question of law enforcers not taking complaints seriously? Is it a question of a lower political priority? Also, Bangladesh had been, has been ruled by, women leaders for a fairly substantial period of its history.
Yes, so this is the issue is of there being more women in the workforce, both in the formal workforce, but also women in the informal sector, is an area where Bangladesh has definitely moved forward and a development we can be very proud of. And as a consequence, women are claiming and demanding greater safety and security in workplaces, and also importantly, on the way to and back from workplaces as well. That it's clear that it can't only be about protection and safety inside a workplace, because there's a lot attendant on that. You have to get to that place safely and return. You're working late at night, and you need security generally. And actually, you asked whether it's a question about lack of existence of law or lack of implementation of laws. The way in which the gap in the law, and there was a gap in the law, has been dealt with is actually drawn from a previous example in India, that in both our countries and both our constitutions provide protection in terms of the right to life and the right to freedom of occupation and the right to personal security. But neither of our constitutions give us an explicit protection against violence against women. And interestingly, even in terms of international law and the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, when that was first framed, it itself didn't address the question of violence against women. And much later on, there were separate developments where under international law, you have now, express obligations on states to address the issue of violence against women and to address the issue of harassment at work. And most recently, of course, the ILO with its Convention 190 has put down very specific provisions regarding the obligations of employers to ensure a safe workplace for all, and particularly a safe workplace for women against violence and threats and harassment. So how did this architecture, not the ILO architecture, which is very recent, but the previous provisions, how did they make their way into our own national laws? In India, the Supreme Court of India was petitioned by a women's organization in the context of a woman who was facing harassment, not in a factory or within four walls, but in the work that she was doing in the community, essentially as a social worker, and where she faced extreme violence. And this organization petitioned the court saying that surely our constitution, which does protect all sorts of rights, should be interpreted in such a way that it also means that employers, and they will also talk about other institutions like educational institutions, have to ensure safety within their own institutions. And the Indian Supreme Court did mandate that. And subsequently, years later, in Bangladesh, our Supreme Court also laid down clear guidelines saying that all workplaces, as well as educational institutions, have to, first of all, prohibit all forms of sexual harassment and threats in the workplace against women, and also have to put in place workable measures to ensure that any incident like this can be reported, investigated, and acted upon. And also that, even more importantly, perhaps, that action has to be taken to prevent these kinds of incidents from happening. So people have to be told about what constitutes sexual harassment, what your obligations are not to commit it, to report it, to call it out when you see it, and to also, be able to seek justice and to know where you have to go. So we have, in a sense, we have those laws in place. They're not laws made by parliaments, they're laws, made by our courts, but they're binding on everybody within the Indian context and respectively in the Bangladesh context. So then the issue comes to the extent that we have those laws, how effective are they? And one of the things we've seen in Bangladesh is actually the women's movement and many workers' organizations now have been demanding that this judge-made law be turned into a law, a proper law, if you like, from Parliament. And the reasons for that are judge-made decisions, even though they're binding on everyone, have certain limits. Really limits in terms of access. Our decisions, like your decisions in India, are written in English by and large, not always. As a result, of course, they're more difficult. They're not translated automatically into our national language, Bangla, and so many workers will not know what they are. They're written in pretty complex and difficult language. So again, even if they were translated, they wouldn't necessarily be very easily understandable. Of course, many organizations, human rights organizations, legal organizations, women's organizations, workers, have done work to translate and to simplify the language so it can be understandable by others. So even when they have managed to cross that first barrier of making the law, making people's rights and duties known to them, the next question is then actioning them. So we still have a situation where we have a positive trend in that many workplaces have now put in place investigative bodies to look into and to receive complaints of sexual harassment and investigate them. But we also have the situation that very many organizations, unfortunately, both government and non-government, including many private employers, still haven't complied with the law. And the system, the process for non-compliance, because it's a judge-made law, is a bit complicated. You can go to court to complain about contempt of court, about non-compliance with the court's judgments. You have to go all the way to the Supreme Court. It takes time, it's expensive, and so on. Or you can wait for the government's factory inspectorate, to do a inspection and report and take action. There's an interesting development on that front, which kind of shows why laws don't work unless you take, at least in our context, they don't necessarily work unless there's a concerted effort to take social action to implement them. What happened in Bangladesh was the organization I volunteer with, the Bangladesh Legal Aid and Services Trust, we work quite closely with a number of workers groups, on providing legal aid access to workers. So our colleagues were working with the Department for Inspection for Factories and Establishments. And in conversations with them, they were pointing out that the department is responsible for ensuring that they carry out inspections of workplaces to see if they've actually put in place measures against sexual harassment. And interestingly, the initial response from the department was, well, they don't have to do anything about it. It's not their problem. It's not their job, because there's nothing in the parliament-made law about workplaces, the labor law, which says that they have this obligation. So our colleagues then pointed out that the judge-made law also applies to the Department of Inspections, as it applies to everybody in the country. And the department was, I think, very forward-looking and open on that. It engaged with that issue, and it agreed in the end that, yes, they did have an obligation. And subsequently, they invited our organization and others to provide them with more training and information on how they could actually change their inspection checklists so that they would start monitoring factories to see whether they were in fact complying with this guidance or not. And they asked for also more information around what constitutes sexual harassment, how do you understand it, and so on. So in a very long and convoluted answer to your very short question, the point I think I've reached on that is that we have a law, we have efforts to implement the law, but we still have very few complaints and very few actions. And the reason for that, I think, is not that sexual harassment doesn't happen, because there's a lot of research showing that it does. The reason is that there are still other barriers in place, particularly social barriers, which make it difficult for women to still make the complaints and pursue them.
What is the role of business in all this? Because, you talked about a government department, which when it was shown the light of the day, did act in the right manner. And you talked about a civil society group, which, raised this issue, but it has to be ultimately implemented at the factory floor. So how do you think companies are react? Do you lobby companies directly? Do unions do it? How does that play out in Bangladesh?
Yeah, so there are a number of different ways. I mean, as I said, the companies, all private employers are legally bound to comply with this particular decision. But of course, compliance is patchy. So we've seen some very good examples of companies proactively stepping up to set up these kinds of investigative and complaint receiving bodies themselves. We've also seen a lot of them dragging their feet. So I think it's, again, a bit of a varied picture, but there's a great deal that a company can do. I mean, it can be very proactive in terms of setting up a body, it can be proactive in reaching out to, and many of them have done that, where they've reached out to other organizations which have more experience in these areas to set up, to help them to set up the processes. They've also been very open. We've worked with a number of our leading, actually, homegrown companies. For example, Grameen Phone, which is one of the biggest enterprises in the whole of the country, and one of the largest, I think, telcos in operation in the region as well, has got our colleagues serving on its complaints committee. So I think companies, by recognizing where there's expertise, not being shy to call upon that expertise, integrate it into their own functions, where they have a real commitment and an interest to making change happen, have been doing that, and I think that's been a positive example to see. And I think basically also giving the message that when they're finding incidents, that they're taking them seriously and they're acting upon them. There's a very interesting example from an organization which is set up as a not-for-profit, but also has many sister organizations that are profit-making, which was Bangladesh, other legendary organization, BRAC, which runs many which, as I said, has many related entities which are private companies. BRAC has a massive department looking into sexual harassment and doing prevention around sexual harassment and safeguarding. And I'm familiar with what BRAC, the NGO and the not-for-profit does, but I would imagine that they carry that learning, understanding, and massive experience of large numbers of complaints which they deal with on a routine basis into their private enterprises as well. So I think it's an example of it's another example of Bangladesh's success in the development world, and the sort of strength of experience it has within its NGO life and ecosystems being brought in then into the corporate sector and sort of to mutual benefit.
I mean, kind of a wrapping up question, but this deals with the law. I mean, obviously, Bangladesh has laws in place. Bangladesh has a culture where there are at least entities within the government which want to comply. There are companies, both profit making and non-profit making, which want to move in the right direction. And there are organizations such as BLAST and Nari Pokko and all the others that go with it, which are trying to push the specific agenda. In that context, is there a missing link? And if it is it a question of any specific law or procedure? Or is it a wider issue of cultural change and transformation, which always is going to take longer?
I think it's a combination of, I think there is an issue of course, cultural and social change and transformation. And we've seen all over the world that, I mean, it's relatively recent that calling people out on sexual misbehavior, on sexual harassment, on sexual abuse is still an ongoing struggle. It's not a closed chapter anywhere in the world. So in that sense, we can't assume that things are going to be sorted particularly quickly in our part of the world either. But I think we do have another problem, and that needs to be addressed, and that is more difficult. And that is, I think, the general culture of impunity for human rights violations. And we live in a context in our part of the world where the powerful are rarely held to account, and particularly where the powerful are not only moneyed, but where they're able to trade on social and political connections to affect how the justice system treats them. So I think in that context, we see how that plays out in these cases of sexual harassment as it does with everything else, to make it very difficult to actually ensure accountability and redress. So I think we have that challenge on top of the cultural and social challenges in terms of how do we actually get somewhere in dealing with this issue of sexual harassment in the workplace.
And finally, are there one or two good practices of Bangladesh that others should look at?
Yeah, I mean, I think this work that the Department of Inspections is doing, I think that's definitely a good practice. I think the work that the corporates are doing in bringing in experts from the women's movement and from NGOs to inform their and to integrate them into their own practices and procedures, I think that's definitely a good practice. I think there's another practice, which is workers organizing on the ground through learning about their own legal rights and learning about skills of negotiation to speak directly with with the factory management about putting in place preventive measures around sexual harassment is also good practice. I think all of those would be definitely worth learning from. And you mentioned a lot of different ways in which women are very visible in Bangladesh, from the top political leadership down to down to activists and people in different sectors. But we've had some quite remarkable women who've provided leadership amongst workers as well. And I think some of those examples are also worth seeing. People who've been very outspoken and who've had their own experience as workers, people like Kalpana Akhtar, for example.
In fact, I was just going to mention that Kalpana will be speaking to the course later in the,
There's a perfect link in that case.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Good.
No, Kalpana, and we are of course familiar with Najma Akhtar and her work as well. So yeah, it's quite a remarkable story and personal stories, in fact, are very
absolutely
inspiring. Absolutely. Thank you as always, Sarah. And if we do have questions from the participants, I will act as a go-between and pass them your way. You can email them back to me and I will share them with the student body later. But thanks once again.
Sure. Thanks, Salil. Thanks for the time.